Dracula finally pulled back, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Michael's body collapsed to the ground, limp and lifeless, his neck marked by the telltale twin puncture wounds. The Count gazed down at him, licking the last trace of blood from his lips. "And now you are mine," Dracula murmured, his voice carrying both satisfaction and an eerie calm. For a moment, the forest was silent. Michael's body lay still, a lifeless husk beneath the pale moonlight. But then, in the shadow of Dracula's gaze, a twitch, barely noticeable at first, stirred in Michael's fingers. Slowly, his chest rose and fell as if breathing once again, but something was different. His eyes fluttered open, no longer filled with fear or pain, but with something far colder. A hunger, a need, and an insatiable thirst. Dracula knelt beside him, watching with dark satisfaction as Michael, now reborn, slowly sat up. His once trembling body was steady, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The fear that had consumed him before was gone, replaced with a new sense of power, a dark gift that surged through his veins. "How do you feel?" Dracula asked, his voice smooth and almost fatherly. Michael blinked, struggling to find the words. "Hungry," he finally whispered, his voice hollow. Dracula's smile widened once more. "Good. You will feed soon enough." He extended a hand to his new creation, and Michael, still dazed, took it. The transformation was complete. Michael was no longer a victim but something else, something immortal. As the night deepened, Dracula and his new servant disappeared into the darkness, leaving the forest silent once again, except for the distant, eerie cry of a wolf that echoed through the trees. The hunt had only just begun. Paul and Anna are left shaken after discovering Michael's body, cold and drained of blood. The reality of Dracula's power finally sinks in. This isn't just a nightmarish legend, the Count is real, and he is hunting them. They barely have time to mourn their friend, as the shadows in the castle seem to close in, and they realize they must find a way out. The silence in the hallway was unbearable. Each of Paul's footsteps felt too loud, reverberating off the stone walls like gunshots in the dark. Anna was just a few paces behind him, her breath shallow and quick, her fingers trembling as she held the lantern they had found in the abandoned quarters. "I can't take this," Anna whispered, her voice breaking. "It's like he's watching us. I can feel him, Paul. He's inside my head." Paul stopped and turned to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "We'll get out," he said, though his own voice sounded unconvincing. "We'll find a way out, Anna. We have to." But in the back of his mind, Paul felt the creeping doubt, the cold fingers of fear wrapping around his thoughts. Dracula's presence was oppressive, seeping into the very stones of the castle. He wasn't just following them, he was in the walls, in the air, in their minds. Paul blinked hard, trying to shake the feeling, but it was no use. Dracula's voice echoed faintly, as if whispered by the wind, "You cannot run from me." Asterisk. Anna gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" Paul nodded slowly. "We need to keep moving." But even as they moved forward, the voice followed, slipping into the cracks in their minds. Every step they took felt heavier, as if the very castle was trying to hold them in place. Paul could hear the soft click of something behind them, a footstep that wasn't theirs. "Paul," Anna's voice was barely a breath. "I know," he replied, his heart pounding. "Run." They didn't see him at first. It was the sound that alerted them, a soft rustling, like the movement of fabric in the wind. Anna froze, the lantern shaking in her hand. Paul grabbed her arm, pulling her close as they pressed themselves against the stone wall of the corridor. For a moment, everything was still. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Paul saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows, too fast to register clearly. His breath hitched as the air around them seemed to grow colder. "Paul," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible. Suddenly, Dracula appeared, stepping out from the darkness as though he had always been there, his figure tall and imposing. His face was a mask of calm, his dark eyes glinting with amusement as he watched them. "You cannot hide from me," Dracula said softly, his voice as smooth as silk. "You are mine." Paul felt Anna tense beside him, her fear palpable. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Dracula's gaze was paralyzing, holding them in place like prey caught in a web. Then, with a swift motion, Dracula lunged. Paul barely managed to pull Anna aside as the Count's hand swiped through the air, missing them by mere inches. They stumbled back, Paul's heart racing, as Dracula smiled, a smile that promised death. "Run!" Paul shouted, grabbing Anna's hand and pulling her down the hallway. Behind them, Dracula's laughter echoed, a low, menacing sound that chilled them to the bone. They ran, but the Count's footsteps were always close, his presence always felt. There was no escaping him. Not here, not in his castle. Paul and Anna huddled in the corner of the ancient shrine, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The faint glow of the sacred altar cast long shadows across the stone walls, and for a brief moment, they felt safe. But they both knew it wouldn't last. "He's coming," Anna whispered, clutching Paul's arm. "He's not going to stop." Paul gritted his teeth, his body trembling with exhaustion. "I know, but maybe this place can hold him off. Maybe it's enough." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Dracula was too powerful, too relentless. The shrine's faint protection wouldn't last. Suddenly, the door to the shrine burst open, and there he was. Dracula stood in the entrance, his figure looming, his eyes glowing with a dark, malevolent light. The air around him crackled with energy, and Paul felt the weight of his presence pressing down on them. "You have run far enough," Dracula said, his voice low and dangerous. "This ends here." Paul stood up, his legs trembling beneath him. He could feel Anna's hand tightening around his arm, but he forced himself to meet Dracula's gaze. The Count's eyes were like deep, endless voids, sucking the air out of the room. "Why?" Paul demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "Why us? Why play these games?" Dracula's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only hunger. "You misunderstand, Paul. This is not a game. This is survival. You entered my domain. You belong to me now." Paul's heart pounded in his chest, but something inside him, perhaps the grief over Michael's death, or the sheer desperation of their situation, made him push back. "We don't belong to you," he said, his voice rising. "We're not your prey. You think this makes you powerful. Hunting us like animals. You're a coward." Dracula's eyes flared at the word, and for the first time, Paul saw a flicker of something beneath the Count's calm exterior, anger, perhaps, or even a wounded pride. The shadows around him seemed to pulse, growing darker and more oppressive as the Count took a step forward. "You dare challenge me?" Dracula's voice was a hiss, his calm veneer slipping away. "Do you not know what I am? I have lived for centuries. I am the night itself. You are nothing." Paul swallowed hard but stood his ground, forcing himself to ignore the instinct to run. He could feel the oppressive weight of Dracula's power, but he couldn't let the Count see his fear. "You're afraid," Paul said, his voice barely a whisper. "You wouldn't be hunting us like this if you weren't." For a moment, there was silence. Dracula's expression darkened, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Paul could feel the cold seeping into his bones, and Anna's grip on his arm tightened even more. Then, In a blur of motion, Dracula was in front of him. Paul didn't even see him move. 1 second, the Count was across the room, and the next, he was inches away, towering over him. Dracula's hand shot out, grabbing Paul by the throat and lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. Afraid, Dracula growled, his voice like ice. "You are nothing to me, Paul. I could end your life in an instant." Paul struggled to breathe, his vision swimming as Dracula's grip tightened around his neck. He could feel the darkness closing in, could hear Anna screaming his name in the background, but his strength was failing. He couldn't fight back. But then, just as he was about to lose consciousness, Dracula flinched. His grip loosened, and he dropped Paul to the ground, stepping back with a snarl. Paul gasped for air, clutching his throat as he looked up at the Count in confusion. The shrine, whatever ancient power resided within the walls of this place, it was affecting Dracula. The Count's face twisted in anger as he looked around, clearly agitated. He took another step back, his eyes flicking to the sacred altar at the center of the room. "This place," Dracula spat, his voice filled with disdain. "It weakens me." Paul seized the moment, pulling himself to his feet. "Then maybe it's not us who should be afraid." Dracula's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Paul thought he saw something close to fear flicker across the Count's face. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by cold fury. "You think you've found sanctuary here?" Dracula snarled, his voice rising with barely controlled rage. "This place will not save you. You cannot hide from me forever." With a final, seething glare, Dracula turned and vanished into the shadows, his figure dissolving into the darkness as though he had never been there at all. The oppressive weight lifted, and Paul felt the air rush back into the room as if a great storm had passed. Anna rushed to Paul's side, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Paul, are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. Paul nodded, still catching his breath. "I'm fine," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "But we have to move. This place won't hold him for long." Anna looked at the altar, her eyes filled with desperation. "But where can we go? If he can follow us anywhere?" Paul didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they couldn't stay here. Dracula might be weakened by the shrine, but he would find another way to get to them. They had to keep moving, keep running. It was their only chance. "Let's go," Paul said, his voice firmer now. "We can't stop. Not until we're out of this nightmare." They fled from the shrine, the cold night air hitting them like a wall as they emerged back into the forest. The trees were still and silent, but the sense of danger was ever present. Every shadow seemed to pulse with menace, every rustling leaf a reminder that Dracula was close behind. Paul led the way, holding onto Anna's hand as they stumbled through the dense undergrowth, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dead leaves and branches. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the forest floor.